On the subject of joining forces, I have now the pleasure to announce one of the strongest forces that we actually have in Europe, and whom better could we have to follow on to the words of our Commissioner than Professor Jacqueline McGlade from our European Environment Agency. We will also evacuate the chair, but this is of course not a sign of disinterest, but from over there we will be able to follow much better Professor McGlade's presentation.
Thank you very much, and again, a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation to, in fact, open, in some senses, where your debate will go. I'm going to take a slightly different view, I suspect, than many of you perhaps will have been thinking about, in that I'm going to try and step us a little bit into the future as to why we're doing all this work, and give you some insights as to how the agency itself is trying to work comprehensively to anticipate very much how much of the information that you're gathering, the standards that are being set, and how we can then reach out in communicating with our colleagues across the world to really try to deploy INSPIRE as one of the meaningful tools to using spatial data in many of our international conventions and discussions. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a little insight into where we're going. But before I do that, I just want to remind you, of course, that the European Environment Agency has, of course, many other member countries than the EU27. We're delighted that we have the EFTA countries, also Switzerland and Turkey. I was very pleased to see we have so many of our Turkish colleagues with us today. And more we're working in the West Balkans and in the neighborhood program, both East and South, which gives us quite a significant challenge when it comes to providing backbone to information. When the founding regulation of the agency was established, it brought with it, I think, one of the greatest innovations, certainly from a perspective of many years ago, 15 years ago. It could hardly have been envisaged how appropriate what we now know as IONET really is, because in fact, by being a network of people whose job it is to work together on information and observing, we have actually anticipated not only the internet, the worldwide services, but also the way in which we see more and more discussions around the environment going. And so that combination of the agency based in Copenhagen, the IONET in all of our member countries, perhaps gives us one of the most strongest and in fact legitimate ways in which we can talk comprehensively from administration all the way up to a European level, where we speak comprehensively about all of the detail and yet get this perspective at a regional level when we sit in places like the UN together with colleagues around the world. This is, in a sense, one of the landscapes that we deal with on a regular basis. So although we have our core countries, we, as I say, are launched now on a very intensive process in the neighborhood, and this shows the east part of the neighborhood program, where we're having an ongoing dialogue. And in fact, I'm returning on Monday back to Russia to talk with the Duma about putting in place the environmental monitoring. And I hope that we can actually anticipate that they will also adopt INSPIRE. Perhaps it's INSPIRE Light, but certainly some of the proposals that we have about how we might exchange information. And I'll come to that because it has great relevance for when we get to Cancun, the next round of the COP meetings for the climate change, and also for the Convention on Biodiversity. So this is our daily business now, and working with funds from the Neighborhood Program, with DG RELEX and External Action, we really have to try to put in place in all of these countries, and also in the Mediterranean, including North Africa, a comprehensive spatial data infrastructure. We also work in the north to the Arctic with our colleagues in the Arctic Council, and there we have an ongoing dialogue, not only with Russia, but also the USA and Canada. The core of our work, of course, is around priority data flows, and these up until now have primarily been non-spatial in the way that they've been delivered. But of course, as life has moved on, more and more of them have required priority towards the policy making. And so we've lived with this idea, which I try to show here, which is many of us are actually very, very engaged with one of the dials. We really know a lot about it, we know the detail of it, we know the technical background. This for me is a kind of a pleasure. You deal with all of the information, but really what Mr. Potocznik needs is the Porsche version. He just needs 4 dials to tell him approximately that we're going in the right direction. And so one of the challenges we see is trying to distill down a lot of information from the administrative and from the environmental field, which is meaningful scientifically, but which then has to be translated into policy. And it's that transition that I'm going to talk about today in how we see INSPIRE as underpinning part of that work. So we've gone really in the last 4 or 5 years from something where you could, I would say, caricature it as where a lot of paper was moving towards Brussels on large trains, put on shelves, and probably never seen again, to a moment where we have finally, I think, arrived, even in the Commission, where we have digital transmission of information, even compliance information is sent digitally, and it's checked by us, and so on and so forth. So we've really moved into a different world of online services, where in a sense the quality assurance really has to be embedded at both ends. So this is a very different kind of mode of working, because it now means that under the rubric of what we've called the Shared Environment Information System, we're really trying to repatriate or maintain the information and data at source, close to the people who have responsibility for it, but giving, in a sense, another responsibility to make it available. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if that's needed, but certainly making sure that there's a comprehensive arrangement for quality assurance from source to supply, but at the same time recognizing that in the end we need to make it available to the public. And under the Aarhus Convention, environmental data, it's basically a part of the convention that says the public must have access to that. Now, of course, resolution is an issue that we can discuss, but there's a fundamental principle which Europe has signed up to and which, of course, we need to respect. So accessibility, interoperability, and ultimately public availability, these are all, in the end, the final manifestations which we're working towards within the context of SAIS, INSPIRE, and also then GMES. What we have seen, of course, that in the last few years, more and more of the data that people want to have access to is spatial data. When I arrived in the agency 7 years ago, I have to say that it was probably only 10%. It's now easily even 90% of our data have a spatial tag. Whether that comes through a metadata tag, whether it is truly spatial, it is a matter of discernment. But in principle, what we can say is that people are interested in what is happening at their location. And that context then means that we've spent a lot of time thinking very comprehensively with our colleagues around the world in the big global programs as to how we can capture that. So through the OGC, through many other consortia, these are kinds of issues that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but which now need to be made operational. So I have 3 elements really to discuss this morning: the GMES, the SAIS, and INSPIRE. Now, for those of you who aren't in the business of space and Earth observation, you may have missed it, but I somehow doubt it. There's a program called Global Monitoring for Environment and Security, and it has spawned a huge number of acronyms. I can see I've put most of them up there. GISC, EEA, and there's a few others, GEO, GEOS, there's many, many others. If it's got a G, it's probably global. If it's got an E, it might be environment. If it's O, it's probably observing, but it might be something else. So there's a whole range of them, but you kind of get the idea that out there, there's a whole world. What might have passed you by, if you're not a space sort of advocate, is that Europe now has a space policy, and we're moving towards operational lines at a European level. So working with the European Space Agency, we have a variety of Sentinels platforms which are being launched over the coming 5 to 8 years, some to replace existing satellites which have come to the end of their lifetime, but many others which are new and novel, bringing ways in which we can sense the environment. So we have a number of what are called fast-track services, core services in the more, I would say, traditional way of talking, where we see these as being public good, from which then downstream commercial services will be developed. Now, of course, because they're raster-based, because they're spatial, they have a meaning within the INSPIRE community. And I do think that probably later on this week you'll be talking